The Puritans. If you went to grade school in America, you probably remember learning about them. And if you're of a certain age, you may have some recollection of getting dressed up in those black and white outfits with the bonnets and enormous top hats for your school's Thanksgiving pageant. I can remember learning that they were the first European immigrants to America and that they came here seeking religious freedom. They were, as my teacher told me, the ones who laid the foundations for the American identity. But it's a little more complicated than that. Notwithstanding the many cultural contributions from Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and the various ethnic groups who would come down the pipeline in later years, even the first English immigrants had their own distinct identities that would come to shape the nation's character in unique ways. In 1989, the historian David Hackett Fisher wrote a book called Albion's Seed. Drawing on the ancient name for England, he proposed that the common American identity could be divided into four formative ethnic groups that put down roots early in the American experiment that were deep enough that their influence can still be felt today. To each of these folkways, he ascribed a different identity, tied to its place of origin back in England. From East Anglia came the Puritans, whose descendants would go on to dominate the elite institutions and corporations of the American Northeast. Think of the Ivy League, the Blue Bloods, who until recently dominated the Republican Party, and the old money behind many of the most prominent financial institutions in America. From the south of England came the Cavaliers, former English royalists who would go on to form the landed gentry of the Deep South, the plantation class of the Confederacy, who went to war with the Union over slavery. No less influential to Southern culture, in a different way, were those in the fourth group, from the borderlands that divide England and Scotland, some of whom stopped over in Ireland before putting down roots in Appalachia. Today, most people refer to them as Scots-Irish, and a lot of the popular image of the rugged, individualist Western pioneer is rooted in the contributions of these ancestral cattle raiders and highwaymen. But it's the third group that is of particular concern to our story today. They hailed from the English Midlands, and largely under the patronage of William Penn, they settled in the Delaware Valley, sowing their religious traditions everywhere they went. They were the Quakers, the Society of Friends, and it was within this group that our protagonist, Smedley Darlington Butler, was born and raised.
Hi, I'm James Benson Sarsgaard.
And I'm Prester John Anders, and you're listening to Americana Obscura.
DJ, you once told me that the Quakers were sort of like the woke activists of their day. You want to tell us what you meant by that?
Yeah. So the Quakers were an offshoot of the Puritans who emerged during the English Civil War. There's an interesting linguistic and thematic parallel with the term woke because both terms began as self-identification but slowly morphed into a pejorative. The term originated in an English courtroom in 1650, when George Fox, the leader of the Quaker movement, was summoned to court where he sternly rebuked the judge to tremble at the word of God. But the magistrate sneered back that Fox and his followers were Quakers, people who would quake and shake. The name stuck, and this is what we call that Christian sect even today. Much in the same way, to be woke was originally a term used in the Black American community to describe being awake or woke what they saw as the injustices of the world. Just as that judge turned around this self-identified term into a pejorative, so too the term woke has become a meaningless polemic. But in both cases, it describes something real and recognizable. And for better or for worse, much of what we see as what would become woke in the American progressive tradition began with the Quakers. Of course, they didn't call themselves the Quakers. They called themselves Friends, or the Religious Society of Friends. And from the very beginning, they were defined by moral conviction in a way that made them admirable to some and insufferable to others. They refused oaths, rejected hierarchy, and allowed women to be preachers in an era where that was unheard of. They talk endlessly about the inner light in every person, rejecting the authority of the church and stressing a personal relationship with God. This stubborn moral seriousness put them at the forefront of early forms of American progressivism, such as abolitionism, prison reform, anti-war activism, and proto-feminism. But, as is often the case, there was a contradiction. As Quakers became more prosperous and embedded in elite institutions, they would become a core part of what would come to be known as the blue bloods of American society. This power and influence was frequently at odds with their social conscience, and they were often deeply embedded at the very top of the increasingly expanding American empire. They could oppose slavery while benefiting from other systems of exploitation. They could preach peace while endorsing civilizing missions of conquest or campaigns of stern moralizing to the masses, all from the safety of their East Coast mansions. Social justice, but administered from an erudite, paternalistic perch. The Quaker tradition was one rife with contradiction.
Yeah, so I guess if I could just interject a little personal anecdote here. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, which is, right in the middle of that mid-Atlantic sort of Quaker world. And my parents weren't Quakers, but it's pretty much impossible to miss for anyone who grew up there how much influence that sect had in political and cultural life. Like some of the most prominent high schools I remember in my hometown were Quaker or Quaker affiliated. And anytime there was an anti-war protest or anything like that, the Quakers were always involved. But as you say, there was a little bit of a conflict there because while their political opinions were quite progressive in most ways, economically, this was pretty much the upper level of the elite social strata in Baltimore, Maryland, Philadelphia, any of the areas around there. So it's pretty easy to see a through line from, you could say from Smedly Butler to Judith Butler, that whole kind of ideology that emerged there that sort of morphed into the progressive tradition that is still holds a lot of sway in the upwardly mobile white kind of activist world today.
Yeah, I think this is at the time of Smedley Butler, this was kind of the height of the WASP power that really seems to have kind of largely gone away. It's maybe in the last gasp when you were growing up, since you don't really see that too much anymore. But that was really the power base that existed at that time. And even going back to the very beginning, you saw that tension between this desire for social justice, but also being very embedded in these power structures.
Yeah, I think you see that even as far back as William Penn, and you certainly see it even today in, the mid-Atlantic power structure of, obviously I think it's probably fair to say that the racial component has become more egalitarian as time has gone on, but it's still sort of there is a economic disparity there between sort of what they're preaching and the lives that people are living, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, and it's something that I found interesting as I've been researching this. There's a lot of talk, especially from the 1960s on. I think especially that the American progressive tradition was just complete aberration. That was communist infiltration or what have you, and maybe to some degree that's true. But I also think this is something that goes back, basically hundreds of years in the American tradition. That I think there's a perennial American progressive tradition that predates the Marxist tradition by, I would say, at least 100 to 150 years.
Yeah, it's outside of the scope of this project, but there's a lot to talk about in those religious revivals that were happening in the early 19th century that I think you still feel in our politics today. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so this is a tension that we saw from the very beginning in the American tradition. And this is the environment that our young protagonist, Smedley Butler, was born into.
Smedley Darlington Butler was born on July 30th, 1881, to a prominent Westchester Quaker family. He was named for his maternal grandfather, Smedley Darlington, a prominent abolitionist and lawyer. The son of Congressman Thomas Butler and Mary Maud Darlington, the Quaker roots of his family ran to the foundations of that lineage, brought from England by William Penn, particularly on his mother's side. In his book, Gangsters of Capitalism, Jonathan Katz writes of Butler, quote, "At 16 years old, he loved baseball, football, and his classmates' attention. The only classes he liked were public speaking and Latin, where the teacher offered dramatic retellings of ancient naval battles. He could so imitate a storm raging on the sea around the Roman galleys," Butler would later recall. His father, Thomas, expected the boy to follow him into law. Acting might have been a better career choice, but Smedley was not conventionally handsome. Thomas had saddled him with the signature Butler nose, a protruding hawk's beak that dominated his young face. The rest of his features were pure Maud, puffy steel blue eyes, sandy reddish hair, and a wily resting smirk, end quote.
The Butler family name still mattered when Smedley was growing up. His father was in Congress. The family name still carried weight. And they moved in circles where people still expected to have some influence over how the country was run. But it wasn't the old money wealth in the way that some people like to imagine. The family had more than cash. They had status and connections. But by the late 19th century, that kind of position could feel a little unstable. You were still expected to live up to the reputation, even if the material foundation underneath it wasn't quite what had been a generation earlier. That's the world that Smedley grew up in. Public service was assumed to be the duty and the right of the ruling class. The path in front of him probably looked obvious to everybody around him. Young Smedley would go into law, politics, or something respectable that would keep the family name where it already was. And for a young man who seemed to be energetic, physical, and not especially interested in waiting his turn, that expectation may have felt more confining than reassuring.
Yeah, so Butler attended the Haverford School, which was a prominent Quaker-affiliated elite prep school, and as we had already talked about, he excelled at sports. He was the quarterback on the football team, but he was kind of restless, and maybe today he might have been diagnosed with ADHD, but by all accounts, he was a kid who just couldn't sit still. He was full of this restless energy.
Yeah, I think that's something that I keep on finding again and again when I'm reading about Smedley. He was very, he liked to be the center of attention. He was somebody who, despite being kind of a little bit of an odd looking, or I guess you could say he has a very distinctive face, he was somebody that had like an undeniable charisma, even from a young age, and would kind of have a certain way with the other kids, even if you get the impression reading his biography, some of the stuff from his early life, he was somebody who was very bright, but not very academic. I imagine maybe he would be one of those people who teachers would say, Smedley's a very smart kid, but he just doesn't pay attention in class.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that sense from him. He's an unconventional mind. He's obviously got a fire within him that is probably apparent to everyone around him from a young age. That he's I think you could say he's a special kid. He's got something about him, but he's not sure what it is yet. But it seems like as he gets older, that's starting to take shape in a fascination with the military. As you said, like military history going back to the Roman era, but he's really enamored with this idea of being a military man, and it's something that appeals to him from a pretty young age.
Yeah, this is I think a kind of a classic case of a young rebellious man who, kind of again very much in that American tradition, wanted to strike out and make his own way and do something a little bit different from what he was expecting from him. Even though, in this case he had probably, if he wanted to, a very cushy and easy life. He could have probably became a politician or lawyer or something pretty easily, and he chose what would become a very difficult life.
Yeah, I think he felt the calling.
By the time Smedley Butler was coming of age in the 1890s, the United States felt like a country entering its prime. The Civil War was a generation behind it. The frontier had been declared closed. Industry was booming, cities were growing, and many Americans believed they were watching their country step into a larger role in the world. For the reform-minded elites Butler grew up around, the same circles shaped by Quaker moral seriousness and progressive optimism, power carried obligation. If America was strong, then it had a duty to use that strength for something good. Of course, then, as today, not everybody agreed. Many conservatives still believed that the country should avoid foreign entanglements altogether, that the Republic risked losing itself by acting like the European empires it had once defined itself against. But the louder voice in the movement belonged to those who saw expansion as responsibility to spread the enlightened American way of life. The language of the time framed intervention as liberation and uplifting the rest of the world, or it could be justified if it served a moral end. And for a young man like Smedley Butler, raised to believe in service and national purpose, that argument made sense. America was also young, confident, and convinced of its own good intentions. The country believed it could make the world better, and Butler believed he could help do it. The impulse that pushed him towards the Marines was the same one that was now pushing the country outward, the sense that history was moving forward, and America had a role to play in shaping it. But across the Atlantic, old European powers were watching the rising nation with growing attention. The United States was no longer just expanding across the continent. It was beginning to step onto the world stage. And then, in February of 1898, the battleship Maine exploded in the Havana harbor and the Spanish-controlled territory of Cuba. James, you once told me that the bombing of the USS Maine was kind of like the 9/11 of the 19th century. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. So in February 15th, 1898, an explosion in the Havana harbor ripped through the hull of the USS Maine as she laid in port, destroying the ship and 2/3 of her crew. A total of 268 sailors were killed, and speculations immediately began to ripple through the American press. The official cause of the explosion remains a mystery to this day, with the current majority opinion leading towards an accidental coal fire igniting the ship's magazines. But a month after the explosion, a naval court of inquiry found that the explosion was consistent with an exterior mine, and the yellow media ran with it. The American public had already begun looking for an outlet for their rage and indignation. In many ways, the political climate at the time must have felt a bit like America in the days after 9/11. The chant, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became a rallying cry. And much like the aftermath of the terror attacks that hit the World Trade Center just over 100 years later, the legions of young men signed up to go and win glory for their country and avenge the soldiers of the Maine. Smedley was one of those young men. "I was determined to shoulder a rifle and help free little Cuba," he said later in life. But there was one problem: his age. Smedley was still only 16, and even if he could have convinced his Quaker parents to bless his military ambitions, he was not legally allowed to fight. But that didn't seem to matter to Smedley. He marched to the recruiting office and lied through his teeth. When that didn't work, he made an appeal to patriotism and his potential for valor. In the end, the officers told him to, quote, "run along home." He was dejected, but not yet defeated. His father remained staunchly opposed to sending his son to die in a foreign war, but Smedley leaned on his mother, and in the end, the close bond shared between the two of them won the day. She threw her weight behind her son and his dream, and used her political connections to secure him a favorable junior officer deployment. It was still the issue of his age, but Maud had a plan for that as well. A few months after the explosion, Smedley and his mother left their Westchester home and headed for Washington, D.C. Perhaps her maternal presence was enough to convince the enlisting officer to take the young man at his word that he was 18, or perhaps they just needed men on the front that badly. Either way, Smedley Butler was soon on his way to the first of many overseas deployments.
Called up the volunteers, I shouldered up my gun. First Spaniards that I've seen, I dropped my gun and run. But I was fighting for this battleship of Maine. I was fighting in this great war with Spain. Fighting for the battleship of Maine. Oh, get back, Spain, I don't know your name. I'm fighting for this battleship of Maine. I out on the battlefield, I fell upon my knees. First thing my eyes fell on was a great big plot of field, but I'm fighting for this battleship of Maine.
Spain in the 19th century, at least in name, was one of the world's great imperial powers. Its empire had once stretched across continents, but by the 1890s, it was a shadow of its former self. It struggled to hold on to its remaining colonies in the Caribbean and Pacific. The United States, by contrast, was a nation on the rise, industrially powerful, politically confident, and increasingly aware of its own strength. For the first time, the two countries found themselves moving towards conflict at a moment when one empire was fading and another was beginning to emerge. In Cuba, a long-running independence movement against Spanish rule drew growing sympathy from the American public. Newspapers, particularly those associated with newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst, portrayed the conflict in stark moral terms. Reports of Spanish brutality circulated widely, and intervention came to be framed as liberation. Many Americans believed their country had both the right and the responsibility to act, to free Cuba and bring stability to a region just beyond its shores. Support for the war grew quickly, shaped as much by public sentiment as by strategic calculation. But by the spring of 1898, the crisis had hardened into confrontation. The United States and Spain stood facing one another, a rising power and a declining one, each representing a different moment in history. For Americans watching at home, the conflict felt like a test. The conflict was a moment when the nation would step beyond its borders and discover what kind of power it intended to become.
Yeah, so this brings us to a topic that has become timely in recent months, the Monroe Doctrine. If there's a real hard break for America, it happens somewhere around this time, I think, where it's really both disentangling itself and distinguishing itself from its lineage as a child of the European colonialism to now a sort of a powerful imperial force in its own right.
Yeah, I think this is kind of also worth noting. This is when America kind of emerged to be more than just kind of a regional backwater, but kind of it was the Catilian or coming out part, if we want to use that kind of waspy blue blood type language of the United States as an imperial power. Since previous to this, we had the Monroe Doctrine, which was our President Monroe had said essentially, the Western Hemisphere is ours, Europe stay out. And up until then, it was implicit. There wasn't too much. There was obviously like the War of 1812. There were some conflicts here or there with other European powers. But this was the United States' first war with a European power in which, spoiler alert, we came out on top. And as you mentioned, this is where young Smedley was only 16 at the time. It's startling how young he is when he first gets involved with this. So much so that he's, begging his parents essentially to sign a permission slip to let him join the military despite being too young. But this is when, Smedley finally is able to join the Marines at the age of 16 in a conflict that, former President Teddy Roosevelt would call a splendid little war.
That it was a little war.
So the war itself unfolded with surprising speed. American naval victories and industrial strength quickly shifted the balance of power, and what many had expected to be a prolonged struggle instead became a short and decisive campaign. The outcome startled observers abroad. European powers, long accustomed to viewing the United States as a regional nation rather than a global one, suddenly found themselves watching a new actor emerge onto the international stage. For Smedly Butler, however, the war ended before his own story had truly begun. By the time he arrived, the fighting was already over. The conflict that had drawn him away from home and the chance to prove himself, to serve, and to take part in something larger than himself had passed him by. The disappointment was real, but it didn't dampen his enthusiasm. If anything, it sharpened it. Butler had committed himself to the life of a Marine, and now he found himself waiting for the opportunity he believed he had missed. The war had ended quickly, but his appetite for action had only grown.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting time to zoom out and maybe do a little bit of examining of the political factions at the time, since I think it's easy these days to think that the progressive and conservative movements and parties or even cultural factions, as you could say more broadly, have been more or less static through all of American history. And you could project that from the present all the way into the past. But as we're seeing here, it's very much not the case, since at the time, the idea that you were going to go out and kind of conquer and or liberate was a progressive idea. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the main proponents of the progressive movement in America at the time. And I think we see a interesting and sometimes ugly parallel between American foreign policy now and throughout the rest of Smedley Butler's life, since we like to use the term spreading democracy now, but at the time it had a different and very ugly dimension. And, that was that of the white man's burden, which, the idea, and even the progressive idea at the time was like, all right, we're going to spread civilization to these other less developed civilizations in countries. And I think that's something that is, maybe a little bit under discussed, the way that there's been kind of a constant shift of these different platforms throughout the parties and cultural factions that exists. But this was really the hinge point that began what we now call the American century.
Yeah, I think there's definitely gradients in what to our modern lens would appear to be a right and a left wing faction of this. It doesn't map that neatly, of course, but you had, in a lot of ways, you could almost say that it was the progressive school of thought that was more expansionist and imperialist, and the conservatives of the time were more isolationist. And this is certainly in part rooted in a lot of what we would today consider to be very racist ideas of many in the isolationist wing, of that they just didn't want any part of they didn't want to bring people into the American fold who were not white, essentially. And there was some tension even within the conservative movement on that. Like I said, there's gradients, but I think that's fairly accurate description of what that tension between those was. So historian Frederick Jackson Turner espoused the basis of what would become the driving force of U.S. foreign policy around this time. It came to be known as the frontier thesis. At its core, the principle that was enthusiastically embraced by President William McKinley and his secretary, Theodore Roosevelt, was based on the premise that societies begin to collapse under their own weight when there is no longer a viable frontier for their expansion. Since by the end of the 19th century, America had defeated any serious threat posed by the Western tribes of Native Americans in the Indian Wars, there was little left of the frontier on the continent. Turner called the idea of the frontier, quote, a magic fountain of youth. American men at the time were also seeing the beginnings of what many today would call a crisis of masculinity, as the rise of industrialization was sapping the nation of the need for many of the rugged physical jobs that had previously kept young men occupied. Perhaps the call to arms that was promised in the annexation of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines would be a balm to this kind of malaise, a way to return to the place where men win glory, as Homer referred to it in the Iliad. If such a call to war and adventure could be heard stretching back 3,000 years, surely the military minds of men like Teddy Roosevelt could see its value at the dawn of the 20th century.
In the aftermath of victory, the arguments of the expansionist appeared to have been vindicated. The war had been short, successful, and widely celebrated at home. Among its most visible champions was Theodore Roosevelt, who had not only advocated for intervention, but had taken part in the fighting himself. Roosevelt had even led his volunteer cavalry regiment, the Rough Riders, into one of the conflict's most famous charges. Roosevelt emerged from the war as a national hero, embodying a new kind of American energy and confidence. To many observers, he seemed to represent the spirit of the moment, a belief that courage, action, and national purpose could shape history for the better. In many ways, the Spanish-American War was one of the last wars of the 19th century, not only in time, but in character. Two imperial powers clashed over territory and prestige. Armies were led by men who still understood the war through the language of honor, adventure, and personal bravery. Roosevelt's Rough Riders became a symbol of that old world, an unlikely mix of cowboys, frontiersmen, athletes, and Ivy League volunteers charging on horseback. Their final charge occurred at a moment when modern industrial warfare was already beginning to render such displays as anachronistic. Even at the time, there's something almost nostalgic about it, like a farewell to an older idea of war as a proving ground for gentlemen and nations alike. The horrors that would define the 20th century when war became mechanized, impersonal, and catastrophic still lay ahead. And so, the Spanish-American War entered American memory as something almost romantic, remembered by some as a splendid little war. For young men like Smedley Butler, watching from the margins and arriving just too late to take part in it, it offered a powerful image of what war was supposed to be: decisive, honorable, and meaningful. It was an image that would not survive his next deployment.
In the months that followed, Smedley Butler finally received the assignment he had been waiting for all the way on the other side of the world. Still riding the wave of a war that had seemed to confirm everything he had been taught about service, honor, and American purpose, he left for the Philippines eager to prove himself in combat. Like many young officers of his generation, he carried with him the image of a war shaped by recent victories in a conflict that was swift, decisive, and meaningful. But the conflict awaiting him across the Pacific would bear little resemblance to the one Americans had just celebrated. The next war Smedley Butler fought would not be remembered as a splendid little war.
Stars and stripes forever, led by best Air Linesman, the Banjo King.
When the Spanish-American War ended in 1898, Spain agreed to surrender control of several of its remaining colonial possessions. Among them were the Philippine Islands, which were transferred to the United States as a part of a peace settlement. But for Filipinos who had been fighting for independence from Spain, the end of the war didn't bring the outcome they had hoped for. Under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, Filipino revolutionaries had declared independence and believed that the defeat of Spain would mean independence for the Philippines. Instead, they found American forces taking over colonial governance instead of ending it. Washington framed the acquisition in moral and strategic terms. American leaders argued that withdrawal would lead to instability and invite intervention from other imperial powers. They reasoned that the islands were unprepared for self-government, and they needed paternalistic guidance from the United States. The language used publicly remained one of liberation and responsibility. The United States, it was said, had not come as a conqueror, but as a steward. They would guide the Philippines towards order and eventual independence. Many Americans accepted this explanation, seeing the continued presence as the extension of the same ideals that had justified the war with Spain. But the conflict that followed was not a conventional war between organized armies like the Spanish-American War. Filipino forces shifted to guerrilla tactics, fighting an insurgency against an occupying power they no longer viewed as liberators. American troops, including young officers like Smedley Butler, found themselves engaged in a campaign of pacification. This became a prolonged conflict fought in villages and jungles where the line between soldier and civilian was often unclear. The war Butler entered would look very different from the one the Americans believed they had just won.
By all accounts, Butler took naturally to combat. He earned a reputation for fearlessness among the men under his command by leading from the front, often putting himself in harm's way. He shared their hardships, endured the same heat and exhaustion, and seemed willing to go wherever the fighting was the heaviest. It was the kind of leadership the Marine Corps valued, and the kind that built loyalty among soldiers who had to rely on one another in close, confusing fights. At this stage in his life, Butler still saw himself as serving a clear purpose. He had grown up believing in duty, and in the idea that American power could be used for good. The war around him was more complicated than that, but as a young officer, his task wasn't to question it. His task was to do the job, and he did it well. I think the Philippines, without getting too deep into, what's outside of the scope to kind of go into like all of these conflicts, but, basically, I think you could imagine that Smedley feels like, okay, we're liberating people from European colonial oppression. Like maybe that's part of the mission. But by the time he gets to the Philippines, I think he realizes that that's not what's going on. Because his first combat
is in a village called Novaleta, and he is not fighting the Spanish there. He's fighting Filipinos who are standing up for their own right to self-rule. And instead of supporting them in this, the United States government decides to attack them.
Yeah,
So-
if I can just jump in again, this is a pattern that we see, unfortunately, that has happened many a times in the history of international American conflict. But that's kind of essentially the situation that the Filipinos found themselves in, where they got rid of their Spanish colonial oppressors, and once again they weren't free but under new management.
Yeah, I think this was a tough, maybe sort of like a slow awakening to like what he was really getting himself involved in, because we do see some sort of behaviors emerging with Smedley at the time. And yeah, granted, he's still very young and with a fully unformed brain, as you mentioned, but he's going through probably a lot of the sort of rites of passage that any young boy transitioning to adulthood are going to go through, and he gets exposed to heavy alcohol consumption. But in this instance, it's coupled with being in a situation where live bullets are flying around, and he's wondering what the hell he's doing there. And so he kind of develops a little bit of a problem drinking streak here that will kind of follow him throughout his life, but this is the first signs of it. And he falls under the sway of this sort of charismatic, cocksure, heavy drinker named Lieutenant W.T. Walker, who I kind of envision as sort of like a Captain Sparrow, like a pirate kind of guy.
Interesting. In my mind, he's kind of like a proto Patton. So now I'm just imagining like somewhere like Captain Jack Sparrow with aviators and a corncob pipe, which is
that could be
pretty cool.
Could be. But he begins to they kind of become drinking buddies, and they do a lot of the things unsavory things that soldiers in the Pacific are going to do. And a traveling Japanese tattoo artist arrives at their base, and everybody starts getting tattoos. And Smedley decides that he wants to get the emblem of the Marines, the Great Eagle, tattooed across his chest.
Mm-hmm.
So
and I think it's worth noting that it's there's a lot of jokes about how boomers ruined X or boomers ruined Y. But I think the criticism of like the millennials and younger maybe ruining tattoos, at least to the sense where like the joke is it used to be you see somebody with a bunch of tattoos and they could probably kill you if they needed to. Now you think they maybe work at a restaurant and can make a really mean creme brulee. But this is even like 100 years ago, tattoos were not a common thing, and especially uncommon for somebody his age. So he was, that's the interesting thing I keep on finding with this story. There's a lot of mythologization, obviously, but it does seem like Smedley Butler was a genuinely very brave and badass person, despite the fact that, I think we touched on this. He was kind of a little guy with kind of a hawk nose. He was kind of like a dorky, nerdy looking guy, but he had a lot of piss and vinegar in him, as they say. But unfortunately, Smedley did end up, this tattoo did end up getting infected, and he got very sick.
Yeah, I think it's funny too that it's like you said, he was kind of a badass. Like a lot of people you would think like might be like, oh, my first tattoo, maybe I'll get like, like a sword on my shoulder or something like that. Like he's like, no, I want a full chest piece.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed from our boy Smedley. He does not do anything by half measures. He is
he's all in.
He does things whole last, as you might say.
Yeah. Respect.
But
I mean,
yeah. But that all having been said, this was it's an interesting case because it's on one level, we're talking very very fondly about this figure because I think we both have developed a decent amount of affection for him as a human being and as a historical figure. But again, this is one of the things that really strikes me over and over as we're researching and while I was reading and as we're talking about this and as we're doing this episode, all of these episodes, the contrast between Smedley Butler as a man, but also the situation he was in, because this was, there's no real way of sugarcoating it. The United States occupation and I guess conquering of the Philippines was a brutal affair, which again, I think if you want to talk about the USS Maine as, the 19th century's 9/11, the Philippines was kind of like the 19th century's Vietnam. As the conflict dragged on and American forces struggled to suppress growing insurgency, the tactics used to maintain control often became increasingly harsh. Guerrilla warfare blurred the line between combatant and civilian, and frustration among the American units often transferred into collective punishments. Marines burned villages, forced relocations, and reprisals against the natives believed to be secretly aiding the insurgents was often draconian. They would do whatever it took to deny insurgents food, shelter, and support, even if it meant punishing the innocent. What had begun as a war of liberation increasingly took on the character of occupation. Among the most controversial practices was what soldiers called the water cure. Prisoners suspected of aiding insurgents were often forced to ingest large quantities of water while restrained. This was a much more extreme version of the waterboarding technique that would become controversial over a century later during the Global War on Terror. This technique produced extreme pain and the sensation of drowning until information was given or consciousness failed. Officers at the time defended the practice as a method of interrogation rather than torture, but even contemporary observers recognized its brutality.
The actions taken by U.S. Marines were later investigated in a committee led by Elihu Root, the Secretary of War under McKinley and Roosevelt, as part of the Philippine Investigation Committee. From this investigation, an unnamed soldier reportedly said, "The Spanish used the torture of water throughout the islands as a means of obtaining information, but they used it sparingly and only when it appeared evident that the victim was culpable. Americans seldom do things by halves. We come here and announce our intention of freeing the people from 300 or 400 years of oppression and say, we are strong and powerful and grand. Then to resort to inquisitorial methods and use them without discrimination is unworthy of us and will recoil on us as a nation." For young officers like Butler, these brutal, pragmatic tactics were the reality of war. The Marine Corps prized aggression and effectiveness, and success was measured in pacified territory. Individual acts of bravery existed alongside tactics that sat uneasily with the ideals many Americans believed they were defending. The contradiction was not yet fully visible to Butler himself, but it was already part of the war that was shaping him. It was a very brutal and prolonged conflict, and I think it was really a harbinger of like where the U.S. military was headed in a lot of these other conflicts that were coming down the pipe. So this was just the beginning of the kind of the concept of forever wars is really born here.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think this lasted a couple years, and from like him being 17 to 19. So again, he was so young.
Yeah, and particularly like this sort of like slowly peeling back the veneer of what he's involved in just gets more pronounced with the next conflict, which takes him to China for what has become known as the Boxer Rebellion. What do you know about the Boxer Rebellion, PJ?
By the turn of the 20th century, China occupied a position very different from the one it had held for centuries. For much of its history, the Qing Empire had been the dominant power in East Asia, economically and culturally influential across the region. But by the late 19th century, a series of defeats at the hand of Western powers in Japan had weakened the imperial government and eroded its sovereignty. In what became known as the Scramble for China, foreign nations had secured trading concessions, territorial footholds, and legal privileges that placed their citizens beyond China's authority. Chinese markets were opened by force, flooded with foreign goods, and shaped increasingly by outside interests. The opium trade, imposed through earlier conflicts, left deep social and political scars. What Chinese historians would later describe as the century of humiliation was already well underway. Under this forced treaty, the imbalance of power was visible in everyday life. Western enclaves operated under their own rules, symbols of foreign dominance inside Chinese cities. Stories circulated of colonial clubs displaying signs that read, "No dogs or Chinese allowed," a small but telling expression of how power and humiliation were experienced at a human level. For many Chinese, foreign influence appeared as occupation in all but name. Out of this environment grew a bitter wave of anti-foreign resistance. Violence spread across northern China, directed at missionaries, foreign businesses, and Chinese converts to Christianity who were associated with Western influence. What became as localized unrest gradually escalated into a broader uprising. This conflict was fueled by resentment towards both foreign powers as well as the weakened imperial government that were seen as unable to defend the country's independence. As attacks intensified and foreign citizens sought protection, imperial governments moved in to defend their interests and personnel. An international expeditionary force was assembled to relieve colonial business interests and restore order. Amongst the American troops sent to China were the United States Marines, including a young officer named Smedly Butler. Once again, Smedley was entering another conflict shaped by overlapping demands of empire, commerce, and protection of American lives abroad. They were deployed to confront the rebels, who were dubbed Boxers, from whom the conflict gets its name. But interestingly enough, Boxers is actually somewhat of a mistranslation.
They call themselves, so basically, like you're saying, the context of it is in what you're saying is like the century of humiliation, the scramble for China, and the backdrop is that there was a lot of flooding in the Shandong province around the Yellow River, which led to a massive famine. And this happened on the heels of, all of these colonial entrenchments by the British, the Germans, European powers. America was getting involved as well. The DuPonts, John Jacob Astor. There was a lot going on in the aftermath of the Opium Wars that American business interests were involved in. So there's already this feeling of like venomous anti-Western sort of populist sentiment among the Chinese people. And this flood happens and there's massive famine. People apparently were so hungry they had resorted to eating cotton. And in the context of this, this is probably the most mysterious part of it, is coming from, like you said, the name of the Boxer Rebellion arises out of this strange supernatural martial religious cult that was called the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, which was a group of dispossessed.
Super cool name, by the way.
Awesome name. And like they're badass. Like it's like the stories of it are mythical. Like it's hard to really figure out like how much of it's true, how much of it's obviously a lot of it is self-mythologizing on behalf of this group of young men, but they would recruit guys from these poverty, famine-stricken regions and be like, they would basically just be like, I want you to imagine like your god, your totemic power, and that will give you basically like magical fighting powers. And these guys believed that they had supernatural fighting powers. And so they were engaging in this ritualized martial arts training that probably was related to a lot of the disciplines of martial arts that were historically important in China. But because Westerners saw these guys in strange outfits, like fighting and using swords, they were like, they didn't call them the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. They were like, they're boxing. We're going to call them the Boxer Rebellion, which is kind of a watering down of what I think is kind of a pretty awesome, like sounding mythical army.
Yeah. Lost in translation, unfortunately.
Right. But yeah, I mean, the men were recruited into this, and basically like this mythology spread that like we're going to be like an invincible army of spiritual warriors that's going to free ourselves of this colonial influence and bring back Chinese native superiority. And they were explicitly anti-Christian in their rhetoric and their actions. That was directed largely at foreign missionaries who they began to attack and kill, but also at any Chinese who had converted to Christianity.
Yeah. I think the important part that you mentioned is like, this is where the yoke of colonialism was really starting to chafe on the Chinese people. And I guess, I guess what we'd call today the global South more broadly. But this was like the first shocks of, what later would become the Chinese Civil War. But the important part for our story is that, this was one of the first shocks, and many more would come later, in which these nationalist rebellions would buck against colonial power, and there would be, as you said, they would attack Western colonial business interests, and as well as, like you mentioned, the Western missionaries were a particular sore spot for them. So there was an 8-nation alliance of all these different colonial powers that would intervene against China trying to liberate itself from its colonial occupation. And this is where Smedley Butler re-enters our story, because it's maybe cliche to say, but American business interests and missionaries, business and Christianity, but these were things that would really strike at the heart of Americans. So that's why the U.S. military was sent there. I think the justification was, all right, we have to protect Christianity, we have to protect these missionaries, but it ended up being much more so the business interests, or at least as much so as the missionaries. And this is where young Smedley Butler found himself stationed in Peking, protecting American business interests as well as some of these missionaries. This is another of those moments where, again, I find myself very conflicted, because I have a lot of sympathy for, people who want to be free and have national self-determination, in this case, the Chinese. And obviously, me being an American, but also like the personal heroism of Smedley Butler in this situation is something that is, again, you never know how much is literally true and how much is mythologized. But, this is where Smedley Butler gets his nickname that he would have for the rest of his life, Old Gimlet Eye, because of like the piercing gaze that he would have in this situation, because his actions, at least on a personal level in this situation, are genuinely incredibly brave and heroic, because it's very easy to, as I was saying, get caught up in the macro level of colonialism and nationalism and national pride. But just on a personal level, Smedley Butler was incredibly brave and, I would say, downright heroic in this situation.
According to the account that spread among the Marines later, this was the moment when Smedley Butler's reputation was made. The fighting around Tientsin had already been fierce, part of a larger effort by Allied forces to push forward and relieve foreign civilians trapped inside the legation compound far behind enemy lines. Butler and Major Littleton Waller were leading the Marines as part of a multinational force operating in unfamiliar terrain, under constant threat from Boxer fighters and Imperial troops. Butler and Waller were leading a battalion of 98 other Marines, along with 400 Allied Russian troops, through a small village on their way to the legation compound, when suddenly Boxer soldiers began to fire from all sides on the Allied troops. The Russians retreated, but Waller rallied his men and returned fire. They fought bravely to create the cover required to withdraw from the village. When the shooting finally stopped, the cost became clear. Several Marines were dead and others were wounded. Butler did a head count, and he found that someone was missing. In the confusion, one man had been left behind, a private named Carter.
The story that follows is where history blends with legend. Butler was ordered to retreat and leave Carter behind, but Smedley couldn't leave a man, a brother, behind enemy lines. He disobeyed orders to continue the withdrawal, and he gathered a small group of Marines and pushed back into the line of fire to find this missing man. Carter was discovered badly wounded with a broken leg, unable to walk. He was exposed and alone. While some of the Marines held off advancing fighters, Butler and another man fashioned an improvised stretcher and began the long retreat back to safety. Butler and his men carried the wounded comrade over 7 miles in an excruciating 4-hour trek through mud and enemy fire. It was a slow, exhausting work, every step taken under the expectation that it could be their very last. Eventually, Butler and his men were able to rejoin the Allied troops with no casualties taken. Carter would later die of his wounds, but he wasn't captured, and he didn't die alone. Butler saw to that. Whether the events unfolded exactly as the legend says is difficult to know. This story appears in different forms and in different sources, and the accounts changed over time. Like many stories born in war, the details are blurred as the years pass. But what mattered most in the moment, and what mattered to the men who served with him, was the impression that it left behind. Butler had risked his life for one of his own, and in doing so, he became the kind of officer Marines believed in. It was the sort of story that spreads quickly in wartime, and the sort of story that turns a young officer into something larger than life. And again, we have to take these things with a grain of salt, given the context of the historical time. But later on in his life, Smedley Butler meets a Chinese woman who, she says, do you remember me? And, she was rescued personally by Smedley Butler. I believe she was probably one of the Christian converts. So this is something that, he's very personally heroic. He's rescuing children. He's risking his life. He's taking bullets, has, by all accounts, little to no regard for his own personal safety. And he's able to, they do what they can to rescue American business interests and rescue these missionaries and try to quell this rebellion for the meantime, or at the very least, it was an extraction mission, I believe, to get the missionaries and the business interest out. And later on, it was the rebellion was put down, and colonial rule lasted a little while longer. But that is another of those stories that when I was reading about this, it seems it's just so genuinely gripping and heroic that it's like the real life version of Saving Private Ryan. And you would imagine this guy looking like Brad Pitt or something like that.
Yeah.
He was like a little tiny guy, who had a hawk nose. So he's he's somebody like that. He's very endearing in that sense.
Yeah. Like you said, I mean, he had more than a few times during the his time in China where he either tried to save the life of another of his servicemen, or he himself came under fire. There's another one of these sort of mythical anecdotes where he's shot in the chest at one point, and everyone thinks he's dead, but it miraculously the bullet ricocheted off of one of the buttons on his jacket, and he winds up fine. Which is, it seems like a story.
It only made him angrier.
Right. And of course, also the Marine tattoo on his chest probably saved him too, Mm-hmm. But it's like we're kind of getting into a little bit of a mythical hagiography, perhaps a little bit here, and I'm not sure how much of it. But I mean, that one, it shows up in a lot of the history sources about him getting shot multiple times. We know he does get shot in the leg also during one of those rescue missions, and he was kind of sidelined by that, a more serious injury that sort of kept him in the pup tent for the rest of the conflict. The fighting in China left Butler badly wounded, but it also marked the moment when his reputation began to solidify within the Marine Corps. Reports of his conduct during the campaign moved quickly through the chain of command. Among those who took notice was Major Waller, who recommended him for advancement. While still recovering in the hospital, Butler received news that would shape the course of his early career. At just 19 years old, he was promoted to captain. This was an extraordinary rise for someone so young, and a sign of how highly his courage and aggressiveness in combat were regarded by the top brass. To the Marines around him, it confirmed what many already believed, that Butler possessed the kind of leadership and fearlessness that the Corps valued above all else. For Butler himself, it must have felt like validation. The restless young man who had rushed off to war believing in duty and service had now proven himself under fire and had been rewarded for it. He had survived combat, earned the respect of his peers, and found a clear sense of purpose in the life he had chosen. In that moment, lying in a hospital bed half a world away from home, it may have seemed that war had already delivered exactly what it promised. Smedley had gained honor, advancement, and a place in the world. It was a high point, arriving before Butler had yet begun to reckon with the cost of the wars that had made him.
When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah, swing to my heart, he welcomes and hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and the boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out, we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. The old church bell will peal with joy, hurrah, hurrah. So welcome home, our darling boy, hurrah, hurrah. The village lads and lasses, they with roses, they will strew the way, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home.
Here's where I like to imagine Smedley Butler lying in a cot in a makeshift field hospital on the outskirts of Tien Sen. The air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and the sound of groaning, injured soldiers. Outside, Marines shouted orders in half a dozen accents. Somewhere in the distance, artillery shells exploded with muted thuds. He was 19, not quite old enough to vote, but old enough to kill, old enough to die. He stared up at the beams of the tent, counting loose stitches in the canvas to distract himself from the pain. The doctor had told him he was lucky. A few inches in the wrong direction, and he wouldn't be here at all. Smedley wasn't sure lucky was the word he'd use. Maybe he wondered, how did I end up here? Smedley was the son of Quakers who taught him to see God in all people. He was from a tradition that told him that peace was the most important of God's commandments. But despite that, he had a deep sense of duty to his country and lied about his age to join the Marines. He wanted to fight for his country, or for what he thought it represented. But where had that sense of duty taken him? Not to protect his country, but to invade others. Cuba, the Philippines, and now China. 3 wars before he was legally an adult. 3 violent tests of loyalty that he had passed without flinching. But now, bruised and exhausted, he had time to think. Perhaps for the first time since he'd left Pennsylvania. Perhaps he could still see their faces. Filipino villagers forced from their homes, or Chinese civilians caught between rival armies. The pinched expressions of scared young men wearing uniforms just like his. Were they proud to die for their country? Or were they just unlucky sons of bitches with rifles thrust into their hands and sent to the front lines? He'd seen Marines he so idolized do things he couldn't quite justify or understand. Torture, punitive raids, acts of discipline that looked a lot like brutality once the dust had cleared. He hadn't said anything at the time. He wasn't even sure what he would have said. He was a young officer trying to prove himself, following the example of older men who seemed certain of everything. But somewhere beneath the pain in his ribs, the questions had begun to gather. He might have thought, what are we doing here? What right do we have to be here? And who is this actually for? Smedley wouldn't articulate these answers until decades later. He would go on to be a fiery critic of his own actions and the government he now served in speeches, in interviews, and in a short, furious pamphlet titled War is a Racket. But the seeds of it were beginning to take root. The doubt, the dissonance, and the Quaker conscience bumping up against the reality of empire may have begun here in a tent in Tien Sen.
This is where we leave young Smedley. It's tempting to speculate that the man who stood up to the shadowy forces of American fascism developed this facet of his political consciousness in the trenches of East Asia, but we don't know that for sure. All we know is that at this point, Smedley was just at the beginning of his journey. In our next episode, we'll take a look at how some of Smedley's activities in America's backyard would take our protagonist on a darker road, as an enforcer of American imperial interests in the Caribbean. To quote the man himself, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. Thanks for listening to Americana Obscura. I'm James Benson Sarsgaard.
And I'm Prester John Anders. And tune in next time for episode 3, A Gangster for Capitalism.